Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today we dive into one of the most overlooked yet astonishing last stands in military history, the Battle of Saragarhi. But to understand what made that battle so extraordinary, we have to zoom out, way out, into the dust, diplomacy, and double-dealing of British India's most fragile frontier. Let's set the scene. By the late 1800s, the British Empire was expanding rapidly across the Indian subcontinent, a juggernaut of colonial ambition. But here's the twist. For all its size and swagger, this empire was incredibly insecure. Like a chess player up several pieces but sweating bullets over every move. The reason? That wild, mountainous belt along the northwest frontier, modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan, a place the British never fully controlled. And worse, where another empire, Russia, was creeping in. Welcome to what was known as the Great Game. The northwest frontier wasn't just a line on the map. It was a pressure valve of imperial paranoia. Britain feared Russian expansion into South Asia would shatter their dominion over India. So they turned the frontier into a buffer zone. Forts, outposts, garrisons. It was like plugging holes in a dam with your fingers. Every inch mattered, every signal counted. And that brings us to the soldiers on the ground, specifically, Sikh regiments. Now, the British held Sikh soldiers in extremely high regard, not just for their martial skill, but for their unwavering loyalty and discipline. When things got volatile, and they often did, the empire sent in the Sikhs. These men weren't just troops, they were human linchpins, holding together the empire's most fragile edges. Then there's Saragarhi. Not a fort, not a fortress, just a small signaling post. But strategically, absolutely vital. It sat between Fort Lockhart and Fort Gulistan, relaying heliographic signals, basically Morse code using flashes of sunlight, to coordinate movement and defense across the frontier. A single post, often forgotten, yet capable of turning the tide in a chaotic zone. So picture it, an anxious empire, a dangerous frontier, elite regiments, and a lonely outpost blinking messages in the sun. That's the geopolitical cocktail that sets the stage for what's to come. Alright, now that we've set the imperial stage, let's talk about what pushed this powder keg to explode. The year is 1897. The British are deeply entrenched along the northwest frontier, but so are old tensions, and they're about to erupt. The key players? The Pashtun tribes. Specifically, the Afridi and Orakzai, fiercely independent, fiercely territorial, and fiercely resentful of British encroachment. Now, this wasn't some unified rebellion out of nowhere. It was a simmering stew of tribal rivalry, anti-colonial frustration, and a long memory of British interference. The British didn't just trespass, they taxed, garrisoned, and paved over indigenous systems with foreign control. Imagine someone building a highway through your village, setting up armed camps, and then charging you for the privilege. Yeah, tensions boiled. These were warrior societies that valued autonomy. To them, British presence wasn't just annoying, it was a cultural insult. And as these tribes watched the empire expand its forts and military roads deeper into their lands, resentment turned into resistance. And here's the strategic twist. The tribes weren't blind to the British Empire's weaknesses. They saw the cracks: administrative overreach, strained military resources, command structures stretched thin across harsh terrain. From the tribal perspective, the empire looked strong, but it felt brittle. And brittle means breakable. So what did they do? They struck. The months leading up to Saragarhi were full of skirmishes, small attacks, border raids, and acts of defiance testing British reactions, like jabs before a knockout punch. And that punch came in September of 1897, when a large, coordinated force of tribal fighters launched a full-scale assault across the frontier. One of their primary targets, Saragarhi, a tiny post, a signal relay, manned by just 21 Sikh soldiers. But before we get there, just remember this: empires don't fall in silence. They crack where the pressure builds. And on this frontier, pressure had been building for decades. Here it is, the moment that transforms a dusty signal post into the stuff of legend. September 12, 1897. Saragarhi outpost. 21 Sikh soldiers. Thousands of Afghan tribal fighters advancing. Some say 6,000, others put it closer to 10,000. Either way, the odds weren't just bad, they were mathematically hopeless. But the men at Saragarhi didn't flinch. They prepared to fight. The defenders belonged to the 36th Sikh Regiment, armed with bolt-action Martina Henry rifles, single-shot, slow to reload, but deadly in the right hands. These were disciplined soldiers. They didn't panic. They used the terrain to their advantage, holding bottleneck positions, coordinating volleys, and controlling their fire like a well-oiled machine. Think about it. This wasn't a fortress with endless ammunition and reinforcements. This was a small, exposed outpost relying on tight formation, precise fire, and sheer willpower. And they held. Wave after wave, the attackers came. The Sikhs pushed them back with lead and grit. But slowly, inevitably, the lines began to crack. The outer defenses buckled. Ammunition dwindled. Hand-to-hand combat followed. It was brutal. It was intimate. And it was unrelenting. One by one, the defenders fell. But even as the walls collapsed, one man stayed in place, literally at his post. Signalman Gurmukh Singh. He kept the heliograph going, flashing messages back to Fort Lockhart, reporting every advance, every breakthrough, right up until the very end. His last transmission? A final salute. He knew what was coming. He signaled anyway. The entire garrison was wiped out. But they didn't break. They delayed the enemy long enough for reinforcements to regroup, and in doing so, they carved their names into history, not as victims, but as warriors. So here's the question, was this just military discipline, or something deeper? So the battle is over. 21 Sikh soldiers are dead. Thousands of tribal fighters have moved on. But for the British Empire, the story is just beginning, because now comes the part where sacrifice becomes symbolism. The British didn't just mourn the soldiers at Saragarhi, they elevated them. All 21 were posthumously awarded the Indian Order of Merit, the highest recognition available to native troops. It was like Britain had just discovered the perfect imperial narrative: loyalty, bravery, and noble death in the name of duty. But recognition wasn't just about honor. It was about messaging. Saragarhi became a tool, a symbol, a carefully crafted piece of imperial propaganda. Newspapers hailed the defenders as heroes. Speeches celebrated their discipline. Statues were raised. Their story was included in textbooks. Why? Because the British needed unity, both in the colonies and back home in Britain. And what better way to foster that than a tale of selfless sacrifice by native soldiers defending the empire? Now, let's be clear. The bravery was real, but how it was framed, that's where things get interesting. Because this story wasn't just about heroism, it conveniently sidestepped the very real injustices of the colonial system. It celebrated valor without addressing why these men were placed in such an impossible position to begin with. It rewarded loyalty, but not liberty. Justice for native soldiers? Still elusive. Reform? Largely symbolic. And perhaps most strategically, this moment became codified. Memorials, movies, textbooks, all reinforcing the same centralized imperial narrative: fight, die, be remembered. But never question the system. It's history as theater, sacrifice packaged and sold to sustain an empire. Now we step into the moral crossroads of this story. Because yes, Saragarhi is a tale of courage, but it's also a mirror, reflecting a deeper tension between identity and empire. The Sikhs had a long warrior tradition. Courage, service, and sacrifice. These weren't British values imposed from outside. They were deeply embedded in Sikh philosophy. Concepts like seva, or selfless service, and shahadat, or martyrdom, were already pillars of their culture. So when the British came recruiting, many Sikhs didn't need convincing. They saw military service as a way to express honor and duty. But here's the catch, it wasn't just about values. It was about categorization. The British classified Sikhs as part of the so-called martial races. That's right, martial races, a colonial pseudoscientific theory that some ethnic groups were naturally more suited to war. Brave, loyal, obedient, convenient, right? This classification flattered some and excluded others. It created a sense of pride, yes, but also dependency. The British Empire rewarded these groups with enlistment, pay, and prestige, but only as long as they fought for the empire, not against it. So for the Sikhs, joining the army became a kind of double bind. On one hand, it offered economic stability and respect. On the other, it meant serving a system that ultimately suppressed Indian sovereignty. They were elevated, but never empowered, decorated, but never independent. That's the complicity, not because the soldiers were wrong to fight, but because the system was designed to co-opt their bravery, to weaponize their identity in service of imperial control. So when we remember Saragarhi, we're not just remembering courage, we're remembering how empires exploit values they didn't create. And that brings us to a bigger question: what happens to these stories after the empire falls? History never just sits still. It gets retold, reframed, reclaimed. And Saragarhi? Oh, it didn't fade into some colonial footnote. It evolved. After the fall of the British Empire, both India and Pakistan inherited more than just borders. They inherited memory, and memory is a powerful thing, especially when nation building is on the line. In India, Saragarhi became a cultural touchstone. It was lifted out of the colonial framework and rebranded as a symbol of Sikh valor and Indian martial excellence. September 12th is now Saragarhi Day, observed with ceremonies, parades, even school lessons. Bollywood has dramatized it. Textbooks glorify it. Politicians reference it. But here's the twist. While the memory lives on, the context has shifted. The same act of courage that once served an empire is now framed as an example of Indian heroism, patriotism, even the uncomfortable fact that these men fought and died for a colonial power. That part tends to get downplayed or erased. And what about Pakistan? Well, the tribal fighters, who were resisting foreign occupation, rarely get the same attention. The narrative leans toward silence, which is fascinating, because their actions, seen through a different lens, might resemble resistance rather than aggression. But history, as always, is written by those with power, and in this case, both nations have reasons to sidestep the full story. So what we're left with is selective memory, a mythic version of Saragarhi that fits modern agendas, one that elevates sacrifice but strips away the messy questions of loyalty, coercion, and context. Let's take a breath, because after everything, after the heroism, the violence, the memory games, we're left with one lingering, uncomfortable question. Can bravery exist without glory? The men at Saragarhi were brave, undeniably. But what were they fighting for? An empire that saw them as tools? A chain of command that offered medals, but not freedom? A system that could honor their deaths, but never their autonomy? That's where the moral tension sits. Because this wasn't a noble war for justice. It was an imperial defense of signaling infrastructure. These men didn't die for their homeland. They died to maintain a colonial grip on contested territory. And yet, their courage was real. Their loyalty, their discipline, their sacrifice, those were all very real. That's the paradox of centralized power. It can inspire extraordinary service, but often in the service of something unworthy. And when you strip away the uniforms and the speeches, you're left with a haunting truth. Systems of control don't just demand obedience. They demand meaning. They wrap themselves in myth so that sacrifice feels sacred, even when it's not. So maybe the story of Saragarhi isn't just about what happened that day on the frontier. Maybe it's about how we tell stories. Who gets to be called a hero? Who gets remembered? And who gets erased? If there's one lesson to take from all of this, it's that real courage deserves more than medals. It deserves truth. Thanks for watching Truth Behind History. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to dive deeper into these stories, check out the podcast version of this episode. The link is in the description. And hey, if you like your history bold, thought-provoking, and just a little bit rebellious, stick around. There's plenty more where this came from.